We will make America great again.
There's almost a mythology about this, that somehow when the Pilgrims arrived, they were dragging land behind them. There was no land brought here.
In writing and researching American Indian history, we're constantly swimming against the current of media. All kinds of mythological representations of the relations between indigenous native peoples and newcomers.
Historical research has become a significant part of it for the first time. The attempts in the last 10, 15, 20 years to revisit areas which it was conveniently thought had been solved, that all questions had been answered, is now open to serious questions. I made some notes just quickly before I came about the subjects that people have begun to look at in earnest and have done for the last while. And I say that as a way of introducing this really interesting and excellent book that opens exactly this area up for inspection. This substratum of investigative stuff, it really attempts to puncture illusions and fraudulent interpretations of history.
Generations of mythmakers have glossed over one of the central realities about the founders. Like their peers in New York, in Massachusetts, in Pennsylvania, James Madison and Thomas Jefferson were Virginians first and Americans second.
We will make America great again.
And that was really our starting point, was to see why these assumptions had grown up and why it was that what we were seeing in the contemporary documentation seemed to show a completely, if you like, a parallel universe. There's the official story, and there's the unofficial, or perhaps true story, and we see huge parallels today in so many things, and it shows that spin was alive and well in the 17th century, just like it is now.
Most of us learned a distorted history of slavery in school. So as white Americans, most of us don't realize our connection to it. Here's a quick rundown of historical facts I had not been taught. That the North was deeply implicated, that slavery was legal in northern states for over 200 years, that Northerners up and down the economic spectrum made their livings in businesses tied to slave trade and slavery, that Northern mills processed cotton harvested by enslaved people.
Any white person who was born, raised, and schooled in the United States of America, if you aren't a racist, you're a miracle. Either that or you decided to educate yourself. Because education in this country is about white is right, brown's all right, black's got to stand back. Yellow's mellow, but whites, we educate in a way that says that white males have done all the adventures, have made all the adventures, have done all the discovering, have made all, everything that is good and has been accomplished according to social studies, which is actually anti-social studies, by white males. It's a lie.
We will make America great again.
This is still perpetuated. Sorry, I interrupted you.
You're right.
But thank God there are loads and loads of documents from the 17th and 18th centuries, and amazingly, and to be blunt, to look at, to see, well, why hasn't that appeared? Why hasn't that been used? And you can test, as a journalist should, assumptions against these documents, and you can find that many assumptions are wrong. So perhaps some of ours are, but certainly a lot of the general historians' assumptions are bloody wrong.
Generations of mythmakers.
This isn't just an ideological or philosophical or political debate we're having. There are really, at this particular moment in time, two sort of visions of America and about social change that are at war with one another.
We will make America great again.
I don't have any trouble admitting that I'm a racist. I think it's absurd to try to fight with that. I grew up in this society. I was conditioned by it. I think internally in my psyche, I've grounded and rooted those attitudes, and I see it in me all the time.
I don't like being a white man, and that's where I still am and working on it, because I know what I've done. people like me have done.
We noticed certain patterns that, as we start to look at this, that appeared. One of which was that when you looked at these early people who were sent out, like Mike just talked about, children were sent out, street children were rounded up and sent off. And when you read about the official versions as to why this was happening in the very early 17th century, the official versions were always that this was a great humanitarian thing, that they were taking these poor urchins off the street and sending them off to start a new life in these fabulous new colonies, where instead of having a dead-end life where they die on the streets of malnutrition and illness, they would be given a new chance. Well, if that were true, it suddenly occurred to us, we would surely know that, because that would be one of the greatest humanitarian things that's ever happened in the history of the world. So why was it that that's the way it was painted up at the time, which it was? Even John Donne, the famous poet, who was the Dean of St. Paul's, actually gave sermons from the pulpit of St. Paul's Cathedral about how this is a wonderful humanitarian thing, that these kids will be sent off for this fresh chance. But if that was true, why isn't it something, you'd know that at school, you'd be taught about it. But interestingly, it's something which at the time was made a big deal of, but not now. It's not on any syllabus. So there was obviously something odd about this.
Any white person who was born, raised, and schooled in the United States of America, if you aren't a racist, you're a miracle. Either that or you decided to educate yourself.
Now, as I said, it begins in the 1500s. It was Richard Hakluyt, the Elizabethan promoter of colonization, who first employed the term waste people to describe the expendables that could be literally dumped in the New World.
But if that was true, why isn't it something, you'd know that at school, you'd be taught about it. But interestingly, it's something which at the time was made a big deal of, but not now. It's not on any syllabus. So there was obviously something odd about this.
Well, it's still perpetuated.
Generations of myth makers.
So there was obviously something odd about this.
Well, it's still perpetuated. You find that some history books still talk glowingly about how starving kids were sent to America and apprenticed. You can find it where it happened at Bridewell, St. Bride's Church. I believe there is a commemoration of the apprentices who were saved and sent to America. Well, we looked at the documents as you should. We looked at every document. I'm sure historians must have done, but they missed a lot, because those documents showed that these children were picked up and they were going to be, how they were going to be sold and what they were going to be priced for and what rights they didn't have. In fact, the company gave to itself all rights over these children.
Children were actually taken off the streets and sold as indentured servants to cruel masters in America. They were also notably referred to as the offscourings.
It pretended to anxious parents, there were some, that they would be given apprenticeships, they'd get land in the end. Nonsense.
Generations of myth makers.
In the end, nonsense. Most of them were dead within a year. Anyway.
Nonsense.
This is still perpetuated. Sorry, I interrupted you.
Right.
But thank God there are loads and loads of documents from the 17th and 18th centuries, and amazingly, and to be blunt, to look at, to see, well, why hasn't that appeared? Why hasn't that been used?
Because education in this country is about white is right, brown's all right, black's got to stand back. Yellow's mellow, but whites, we educate in a way that says that white males have done all the adventures, have made all the adventures, have done all the discovering, have made everything that is good and has been accomplished according to social studies, which is actually anti-social studies, by white males. It's a lie.
Then you can test, as a journalist should, assumptions against these documents, and you can find that many assumptions are wrong. So perhaps some of ours are, but certainly a lot of the general historians' assumptions are bloody wrong.
Generations of myth makers.
And that was really our starting point, was to see why these assumptions had grown up, and why it was that what we were seeing in the contemporary documentation seemed to show a completely, if you like, a parallel universe. There's the official story, and there's the unofficial, or perhaps true story, and we see huge parallels today in so many things, and it shows that spin was alive and well in the 17th century, just like it is now. You have the official story about what's happening, and then you have the hidden or covert story about what is really going on. And that's what we find that we were actually going after here.
Let me quote you from that great man, Thomas Jefferson.
How about Thomas Jefferson? What do you think of Thomas Jefferson? You like him?
I do love
Okay,
Thomas
good.
Jefferson.
Are we going to take down the statue? Because he was a major slave owner. Now we're going to take down his statue.
He was worried about the idea that convicts, lots of convicts have been sent to America, and God forbid some Americans have been descended from convicts. He wrote this: "The malefactors sent to America were not sufficient in number to merit enumeration as one class. I do not think that the whole number sent would amount to 2,000, and being principally men eaten up with disease, they married seldom and propagated little. I do not suppose that themselves and their descendants are at present 4,000, which is little more than 1,000th part of the whole inhabitants. At that time, 1,000 convicts a year were being sent to America."
Now, as I said, it begins in the 1500s. It was Richard Hakluyt, the Elizabethan promoter of colonization.
Hey, colonizer. Hey, colonizer. This video is going to make people mad from both sides of this discussion because it's the truth. But that's okay, because it's the truth.
Who first employed the term waste people to describe the expendables that could be literally dumped in the New World.
Oh, my goodness.
In his 1584 Discourse of Western Planting, he hoped to persuade the Queen of the merits of colonization. The American landscape, though he'd never seen it, was described as an unproductive terrain that could only be improved by turning the waste firm into one giant workhouse filled with all the idle dregs drawn from English society. Ex-soldiers, orphans, children of wandering beggars, criminals, debtors, vagrants.
Like, we need to be honest about, like, our people were the losers of Europe. And I don't mean that, I'm not trying to be judgmental or harsh, I'm just being honest. Like when Donald Trump says Mexico's not sending their best, okay, you think England sent their best? The hell? Look, the people say, my family came over on the Mayflower, all right, shh. Why are you bragging, Buttercup? That is not... I don't know who was on the Mayflower, but I know who wasn't. The king. The king was not on the Mayflower. Nobody the king wanted to keep around was on the Mayflower.
At that time, 1,000 convicts a year were being sent to America, according to
1,000 what?
Unimpeachable sources, if you can believe convict traders. In Maryland alone, 600 a year had been going for 60 years. Tens of thousands of convicts have been flooding America. But
literally dumped in the New World.
Thousands of convicts have been flooding America, but does America want to go? No, it doesn't. And it hasn't ever since. You've got all kinds of self-delusions. I mean,
Generations of myth makers.
Delusions. I mean, you've got ideas about why America was so preoccupied in preventing the truth from...
Well, I think that because of being an emergent nation, it was necessary to have a kind of creation myth.
Writing and researching American Indian history, we're constantly swimming against the current of media. All kinds of mythological representations of the relations between indigenous native peoples and newcomers.
There's a kind of creation myth, really, and I think that they were able to create one.
Make America great again.
Because education in this country is about white is right, brown's all right, black's got to stand back. Yellow's mellow, but whites, we educate in a way that says that white males have done all the adventures, have made all the adventures, have done all the discovering, have made all, everything that is good and has been accomplished according to social studies, which is actually anti-social studies, by white males. It's a lie.
In the mid to late 1600s in the colonies of what would become the United States, there was no such thing as the white race. Those of us of European descent did not refer to ourselves by that term really ever before then. In fact, in the old countries of Europe, we had spent most of our time killing each other. We didn't love each other. We weren't one big happy family.
Really. I think that there's a very different thing if you look at what happened in Australia, whereas Australia and New South Wales in Botany Bay was set up as directly, deliberately, they were designated penal colonies. And so anybody who went there, actually, and who's descended from it, they know they're descended from convicts. And actually in Australia it's worn as a kind of badge of honour, because actually quite a lot of these convicts were of course just petty thieves and so on, and horse thieves and general ne'er-do-wells and riffraff.
Political dissidents.
But that's the point, exactly, because quite a lot of them were political dissidents. And so of course, particularly, nationalists and so on, who were rounded up and sent there in large numbers. And of course for them, the fact that they'd been transported for their political views, of course, was like a badge of honour. But in America, it was much more amorphous. This is a much more heterogeneous thing, and it happened in a totally different way. That none of these new plantations, even though they were all about making money.
Now, as I said, it begins in the 1500s. It was Richard Hakluyt, the Elizabethan promoter of colonization, who first employed the term waste people to describe the expendables that could be literally dumped in the New World.
Oh my goodness.
In his 1584 Discourse of Western Planting, he hoped to persuade the Queen of the merits of colonization.
It wasn't about getting rid of undesirables, although that was a large part of it. It was a money-making machine.
In his 1584 Discourse of Western Planting, he hoped to persuade the Queen of the merits of colonization. Hakluyt called America not terra firma, but a waste firm.
You heard that right.
The American landscape, though he'd never seen it, was described as an unproductive terrain that could only be improved by turning the waste firm into one giant workhouse filled with all the idle dregs drawn from English society.
Even though they were all about making money, it wasn't about getting rid of undesirables, although that was a large part of it.
Filled with all the idle dregs drawn from English society.
It was a money-making machine.
One giant workhouse.
And so what one had to do was to actually organize it, and there were so many different groups of people, of political dissidents, religious dissidents, political refugees, and all sorts of people, and people who went of their own free will and then found themselves caught up basically in labor camps and so on.
So they were rounded up, some were branded, put into workhouses.
What? Sound like slaves.
That it was so much more amorphous, and out of it was born an idea of freedom.
White folks' story has basically been this. Our people came for liberty and freedom.
Even at the time when the vast majority of workers, of the workforce in America, were actually used as a slave labor force.
And for most white Americans, we simply don't want to acknowledge the reality that black and brown peoples have known for very long in this country, which is that systemic racism is fundamental and foundational to the country. And if you say that in a public school in the state of Tennessee this fall, right, you're going to risk getting fired, I guess. If you say it in Florida, they're going to be able to sue you. I was just in Indiana, same thing, right? If you say what I just said, that systemic racism was fundamental and foundational to this country from its inception, which, by the way, is not an opinion. It's not an opinion. It's not a debatable, rebuttable presumption. It's a fact.
Yet Americans themselves, as it went on, they wanted to create a sense of this being separate from and different from the yoke of Britain.
Well, white folks have told a fiction, right? White folks' story has basically been this. Our people came for liberty and freedom. We came for principles like that. We came for principles like that. Those people are just coming for stuff.
This being separate from and different from the yoke of Britain, the English colonial system.
The merits of colonization. Hakluyt called America not terra firma, but a waste firm.
You heard that right.
The American landscape, though he'd never seen it, was described as an unproductive terrain that could only be improved by turning the waste firm into one giant workhouse filled with all the idle dregs drawn from English society.
The forests were exactly the reason the king had sent these people to the New England, for here grew the timbers he so needed, tall, straight white pines, ship masts on the stump, free of significant branches for 60, 70, 80 feet or more. Surely the colonists could quickly settle in and get to work supplying valuable resources to the kingdom, with sawmills producing timbers, clapboards, barrel staves, shingles, and all manner of wooden products that England needed 3,000 miles away. But these people had never experienced wilderness forest. The limitless expanses of valuable timber were to them an overwhelming obstacle and daunting challenge. They were utterly reliant on supplies brought on occasional ships from England.
And if they were lucky enough to survive, these idols might be recycled and sent off to fight in English wars.
Recycled.
And so a whole new view was plastered over the top of what was going on in a way in which it couldn't have been done in Australia.
Our people came for liberty and freedom. We came for principles like that. Those people are just coming for stuff. Right? That's what we say in so many words. We came for principles, they're coming for stuff. Let's clear this up. We did not come for liberty and freedom. And I know this because if we had come for liberty and freedom, we would have established liberty and freedom. And I don't just mean with regard to people of color, I mean each other.
One of the keys, one of the problems from our point of view, of course, was how do you understand the relationship between black slavery and white slavery? And we're still grappling with that. You have to read the book to see how. But one begat the other. As some black historians now agree that the basis, the structures of black slavery, enslavement, were built first around whites.
So there was no white race, but in the colonies of what would become the United States, what did we see in the 1660s, 1670s? We began to see that Africans of indentured servant status, many of them not enslaved yet, they were not necessarily permanently enslaved, some were, others were indentured like many poor Europeans.
In fact, white and black for decade after decade lived and worked and died and struggled and ran away together.
Realized, as did the white indentured servants, the Europeans who hadn't even been called white yet, that they had a lot of things in common, like the fact that they were all getting their clock cleaned by the elites. And so they would get together, more than our history books taught us, to foment rebellion against the elite, to try to get a better deal for themselves on the basis of economic necessity and economic justice. And what did the elite do? When you see that you're outnumbered by black and white folks who are penniless, landless, peasants, you have to do one of two things. You either have to kill them all, but you can't do that because who's going to work?
This is something which could not be afforded by the plantation class, by the big planters. And after a big rebellion in the 1670s, they, I think, a deliberate policy of divide and rule developed. Yep. And thereafter, white servants were told that they weren't really the same as black servants. Blacks were slaves and whites were servants. In fact, the black position was worsened considerably. Probably. The white position wasn't worsened, but it was supposedly improved, but it was only marginally. They were still chattels, they were still used, and this was, and they could still be bought and sold. You can see it in wills, which
in wills,
which will the planter's possessions to his sons, etc., and they may include 10 Negro slaves, 10 white servants, etc., etc., along with the horses and the chattels, etc. This went on all the way through the British colonial period. It ended with the War of Independence, and a couple of days into the War of Independence, there was an advert in the Virginia Gazette, and we found this by trawling through the Virginia Gazette. It was an advert, well, many adverts for runaways. This is one of the great insights into black slavery, black enslavement, the number of runaway notices saying his name is whatever, he looks like this, he's got marks of whipping on his back, there's £5 reward if you return to the master, etc. Look, many of these went out for white servants as well. On this day, in April 1770, I'm not quite sure which it was, 1775, which was a couple of days after the first fighting began, which launched the American War of Independence. 10 ads appeared in the Virginia Gazette for runaways. 2 were for black runaways, 8 were for white runaways. 2 of those notices for white runaways were put in by a planter called George Washington.
Washington was a slave owner. Was George Washington a slave owner? So will George Washington now lose his status? Are we going to take down, excuse me, are we going to take down statues to George Washington?
An 18th century plantation was like a small town. At its peak, the population of Mount Vernon was approximately 340 individuals who lived and worked on the estate's 5 farms. The Mansion House Farm was the seat of the plantation, and its dependencies or outbuildings were home to most of the plantation's skilled artisans. Washington's agricultural production took place on the 4 outlying farms: River Farm, Muddy Hole Farm, Dogue Run Farm, and Union Farm. George Washington was a meticulous businessman and manager who was intimately familiar with the workings of his farms and other industries. Reporting directly to Washington was the farm manager, whose chief obligation was to ensure the smooth operation of the plantation and to direct the overseers of the 4 outlying farms. The white and enslaved overseers supervised the activities of the enslaved workforce. Washington's slaves worked 6 days a week, Monday through Saturday, from sunrise to sunset. The length of the workday changed with the seasons. In the summer, when the sun comes up at 5 o'clock in the morning and doesn't set until almost 9 o'clock at night, the slaves would work as many as 15 hours a day. Winter hours were much shorter. Existing records tell us that the slaves were given 2 hours off during the workday for breakfast and dinner. In addition to Sundays off, the slaves had some holidays during the year. Washington gave most of his slaves 4 days off at Christmas, 1 day for Easter, and another for Pentecost. Some of the Mount Vernon slaves, such as blacksmiths and cooks, lived where they worked. Until 1792, the majority of the Mansion House slaves resided in a 2-story wooden dwelling called the House for Families. It probably housed about 60 slaves. During his presidency, Washington tore down the House for Families and replaced it with a barrack-style quarters in the wings on either side of the greenhouse. This was the primary living area for most of the Mansion House farm slaves. Others lived in small wooden huts, which were either single or duplex in design. These huts were similar to slave housing found at the outlying farms. There is some evidence that the quarters at the outlying farms were often impermanent in nature and could, as Washington once directed, be picked up and moved to another location. Slaves were given a rationed amount of food. Adult working slaves received a daily ration of slightly more than 1 quart of cornmeal and 5 to 8 ounces of salted fish. Occasionally, they would also get buttermilk and extra rations of fresh or salted meat, such as pork, beef, or mutton. Slaves were allowed to use land near their quarters for garden plots. Many also kept chickens and ducks for food and to sell at market. Slaves were issued 2 sets of clothing annually, 1 for winter and 1 for summer. Each slave was issued 1 blanket per year. When a woman delivered a child, she was provided with a blanket for the new baby. Medical care was also provided, and George Washington's accounts reflect payment for medical treatment for the slaves. Although Virginia did not recognize slave marriages, Washington did, and marriage was the norm for the Mount Vernon slaves. Marriage provided stability and encouraged births. The status of a child followed the maternal line. If a child's mother was a slave, so was the child. A child born to a free woman was also considered in the eyes of the law to be free. Perhaps most importantly, marriage provided slaves with a sense of continuity, family, and community. However, depending on their jobs, husbands and wives did not necessarily live on the same farm, often resulting in separation of families. Children usually lived with their mother. Spending off time with friends and relatives was very common. Slave children, too young to join the workforce, appear to have done small jobs for their own families. As soon as the child was of an age to join the workforce, generally between the ages of 11 and 14, children became part of a transitional group called working boys and girls who assisted on the farms. An exacting taskmaster, George Washington expected the Mount Vernon slaves to work hard and produce much. He was often disappointed. He tried both reward and punishment to induce compliance. However, there was no real incentive for slaves to work harder. Slaves used a variety of means, both passive and aggressive, to rebel against slavery. Passive rebellion, such as breaking of tools, being sick on a regular basis, and completing assigned tasks at leisure, was common. Washington noted and was often frustrated by these occurrences. Although George Washington had stopped selling slaves by the late 1770s, he used other forms of punishment. One could be demoted to a lesser job, perhaps on another farm away from your family. Privileges, such as going to the market, could be taken away, and in extreme cases, corporal punishment was used.
These are citizens of the United States, 1960. This is a shape-up for migrant workers. The hawkers are chanting the going peace rate at the various fields. This is the way the humans who harvest the food for the best-fed people in the world get hired. One farmer looked at this and said, "We used to own our slaves. Now we just rent them."
And we will make America great again.
Inside the mansion, we can get some idea of the luxuries that a wealthy plantation family enjoyed. The home was often beautifully furnished. Many planters imported fine household goods from England. These things represent part of the wealth that came from products grown on the plantation. Here is a map that explains how this plantation was organized. It was almost a little community by itself. Most of the sections of land were devoted to one crop, such as cotton. Other sections contained orchards, vegetable gardens, and pastures, the source of food for the people and the work animals. The buildings included the planter's home, a mill, workshops, and a row of small cabins for the slaves, who did almost all the work.
George Washington once wrote to a friend that there is no estate in United America more pleasantly situated than this. And Washington was not a man prone to exaggeration. His mansion rests peacefully upon a hill overlooking the mile-wide Potomac River, the centerpiece of a vast 8,000-acre plantation that was home to both the Washington family and some 300 slaves. But even in the 18th century, one could hardly describe Washington's estate as tranquil. In fact, in a letter to his mother, George Washington once wrote that Mount Vernon often resembled a well-resorted tavern, with famous friends and total strangers alike appearing on his doorstep with remarkable frequency. The most sought-after aspect of any visit to Mount Vernon was the opportunity to spend quality time with Washington himself, a figure of heroic proportions. Today, of course, it comes as no surprise that Mount Vernon continues to be a beacon for Americans searching for the essence of George Washington. It is estimated that some 80 million people have climbed these stairs, grabbing hold of the same walnut banister that Washington himself gripped so many times during his 45 years of ownership. For as long as anyone can remember, Mount Vernon has held the title of America's most popular historic house. As one foreign diplomat commented, Washington's home is the heart of America. But a century and a half ago, this heart almost stopped beating. The beginning of our story coincides with the end of George Washington's. Working outside on a blustery winter's day, Washington contracted what seemed at first to be a simple sore throat. When Washington died the following day, on December 14th, 1799, the entire nation went into mourning, and the fate of his beloved Mount Vernon changed forever.
His house had become so closely identified with him already at that time that even though he was gone, folks wanted to come and see where he had lived. And of course, that was really the beginning of Mount Vernon as we know it today, as a shrine for visitors to come. And at that time period, it was typical for folks to try to take a little bit away with them, and pieces of the house literally started going away with them.
It came as little surprise when Washington's great-grandnephew, John Augustine Washington III, was approached by speculators who hoped to develop the property commercially. Washington let it be known that he had been offered the tremendous sum of $300,000. Yet he could not consent to sell Mount Vernon without an absolute assurance that it would be protected for future generations. John Washington decided to approach Congress, suggesting that the government purchase the mansion and the 200 surrounding acres for $200,000. But his timing was unfortunate. Congressmen were already drawing the battle lines for the Civil War, and Washington's estate was located precariously between the nation's capital and Richmond. When John Washington took his appeal to the legislature of the Commonwealth of Virginia, his appeal wasn't really denied. It was almost ignored. And so it was, on a moonlit evening in 1853, when a steamer traveled down the Potomac River en route from Philadelphia to the Carolinas. In tribute to Washington, the captain sounded the horn as Mount Vernon came into sight. Among the passengers was a South Carolinian, Louisa Dalton Bird Cunningham, who found it hard to believe that the home of Washington was in such dire condition.
There were old masts of ships holding up the piazza, weeds growing everywhere, and I think she was distraught. And she wrote a letter to her daughter, Anne Pamela Cunningham. So Anne Pamela, when she got the letter, decided to spend the rest of her life and try to save George Washington's home.
Miss Cunningham decided to write a bold letter to the editor of the Charleston Mercury. Although the language she used was flamboyant, the argument came through loud and clear. If the men of America were going to allow the home and burial place of George Washington to go to ruin, it was time for the patriotic women of America to come together to rescue Mount Vernon. As more and more newspapers published her appeals, Miss Cunningham found herself a most unlikely celebrity. In an age when philanthropy was seldom organized, Miss Cunningham specified that the Mount Vernon Ladies Association would include a vice-regent from every state in the Union. She declared that every citizen, irrespective of age or sex, by the subscription of $1, can become one of the purchasers of Mount Vernon. States began to compete with each other. Leaders from all walks of life became subscribers.
Well, the one person very significant in her beginning efforts was a man named Edward Everett. He had a very illustrious career. He was the minister to Great Britain, he was the president of Harvard, and he gave a speech about Washington. And he gave the speech 129 times all over the country to raise money. And he indeed raised, I think, something in the vicinity of $60,000, which was a significant amount toward the final amount of $200,000, which the ladies had to finish raising.
After working so long and hard to reach this goal, Miss Cunningham hit what appeared to be an insurmountable obstacle. John Augustine Washington absolutely refused to sell Mount Vernon to women. With the help of Washington's wife Eleanor, Miss Cunningham's powers of persuasion won the day, and the sale was finally completed. In early 1860, she moved into the mansion to oversee an even greater challenge, the repair and restoration of perhaps the most important fixer-upper in American history. Fortunately, John Washington did leave behind a handful of items which would form the beginnings of the Mount Vernon collection. The key to the Bastille, presented to Washington by the Marquis de Lafayette. The terrestrial globe, featuring the travels of Captain Cook. And the original terracotta sculpture of Washington, fashioned by the famous French sculptor Jean-Antoine Houdon. One of Miss Cunningham's first and most important decisions was to protect much more than the mansion. Many of her closest advisors, realizing that slavery was a topic that divided the nation, urged her to tear down the simple structures surrounding the mansion where many of the slaves lived and worked. Instead, she decided that everything that was part of Washington's estate deserved to be preserved, from the crumbling mortar of the cistern to the decaying timbers of the spinning house. Over time, this inclusive approach to historic places would evolve into the guiding principle of our national preservation movement. Just as Miss Cunningham was beginning to organize the long list of preservation projects, the dark days of the Civil War engulfed the nation, and she was forced to return to her South Carolina plantation. For the next 6 years, her secretary, Sarah Tracy, and Mount Vernon Superintendent Upton Herbert stood sentry.
During the war, we know that both Confederate and Union troops came to Mount Vernon. Sarah Tracy had gotten a pledge from General Winfield Scott for the Union and from the governor of Virginia that no armed troops would come to Mount Vernon. But that didn't mean that the troops didn't come here anyway, just to visit. And we know that troops from both sides came here quite often. There are even some carvings and some trees here at Mount Vernon, a star and a cross, and the lore here is that those date from the Civil War period and were mementos that were carved into the trees by soldiers.
As the nation entered a period of rebirth and recovery, Anne Pamela Cunningham returned to Mount Vernon with renewed enthusiasm. Fortunately, like George Washington, Miss Cunningham had a knack for picking talented and dynamic people to assist her. The vice-regents she selected were women who broke the mold of the strict confines of Victorian society, and her very first choice was no exception, Anna Ogden Ritchie of Richmond, Virginia.
She had rather astute vision at the time of gathering the women. The first person she asked was a woman from Virginia who was an actress. And in those days, of course, that was rather an unusual thing for an aristocratic lady to be doing.
To serve as the first vice-regent for New York, Miss Cunningham selected the granddaughter of Alexander Hamilton. The first Florida vice-regent, Catherine Dangerfield Willis Gray, became a full-fledged princess by virtue of her marriage to the son of Napoleon's cavalry commander. This group of fascinating women possessed important contacts in virtually every state. Members of the Washington and Custis families donated a number of original pieces to the mansion, including the Nellie Custis harpsichord and the oversized bed Mrs. Washington ordered to accommodate her husband's frame of almost 6'3". Several rooms in the mansion were established as museum spaces, with exhibit cases full of artifacts and memorabilia. Many of the rooms in the mansion were adopted by individual vice-regents, who returned to their home states to gather an assortment of antiques and other furnishings, which would serve as placeholders until the original Washington items could be located and hopefully accessioned through gifts, loans, or outright purchase. For instance, visitors to Mount Vernon in the early 20th century would see an Empire sofa in the parlor, which, although stylish, wasn't crafted until 30 years after Washington's death. Help in restoring the estate to its original appearance also came from the descendants of first-hand witnesses. A number of African Americans who were freed by Washington in his will and others who had gained freedom during the Civil War remained on or near the Mount Vernon estate, often working as gardeners and guards. Vital information about Washington's outbuildings, gardens, and grounds was passed down from one generation to the next.
It's always been known that enslaved people were the master builders of these plantation homes, and Mount Vernon is no exception. There was a lot of pride taken in the skills that you might have seen demonstrated here. You build something, it belongs in part to you. You sew a dress, it in part is your dress as well, even though you are not wearing it. So I think that those might have been the reasons that they came back to take care of it.
As the regent and vice-regents began to recognize the toll that thousands of visitors can take on a structure, the best and brightest experts came to their aid.
at Mount Vernon, we've had such support from wonderful business leaders, philanthropists. Henry Ford being one. He gave the first fire truck to be here on the estate. Thomas Edison actually wired the mansion, and the next generations of all of those people have been very supportive to the current times.
The controversial railroad executive Jay Gould provided the funds to expand the property by some 33 acres. The first vice regent for California, Mrs. Phoebe Apperson Hearst, donated funds to construct a stone seawall to prevent the rapid erosion of Washington's hillside. She also financed the construction of a wharf, which 90 years later was refurbished by the regent of the association, Mabel Bishop, who raised gifts from throughout her state of Oregon. In a similar fashion, Texans built and then restored the entry gate, and Washington lovers in Massachusetts rescued a disintegrating cupola just in time. In addressing each preservation challenge, the association depended upon incredibly detailed research into the papers and books of George Washington, which began to shed light on how he furnished each room in the mansion. Original Washington objects were returned to their rightful places, and exhibit cases were transferred to a small museum. Piece by piece, room by room, the association's quest for authenticity was becoming a reality. And then, with a single controversial decision, the regent and vice regents once again demonstrated bold leadership in the preservation movement.
When we undertook paint analysis in the 1970s and 1980s through the help of Matt Mosca, it really transformed what we knew about George Washington, Martha Washington, and the interior spaces of Mount Vernon. A lot of people were in disbelief that Washington, the father of the country and presumably a man of exquisite taste, was living with what they considered to be rather garish colors.
The paint research at Mount Vernon, detailed and uncompromising, inspired the stewards of other historic homes to take similar steps toward greater authenticity. As preservation technology has become more and more sophisticated, the association has been able to restore aspects of the estate that Anne Pamela Cunningham and the original vice regents hardly knew existed. Using evidence garnered from detailed archaeological excavations, experts have been able to recreate Washington's exquisite gardens and to reconstruct the dung repository, thought to be the first structure in America devoted exclusively to composting. Washington's most remarkable invention, a 16-sided treading barn which revolutionized the processing of wheat, has been recreated through the generosity of the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. With costumed workers, a large animal population, and ever-changing crops, the Pioneer Farm has quickly become one of the most popular stops on a Mount Vernon tour. And 2 miles away, on its original site, a replica of Washington's grist mill, one of the most advanced machines of its day, transforms threshed wheat into the finest flour. Just a few feet away, archaeologists are uncovering the remains of Washington's distillery, one of the largest in 18th century America.
You know, as beautiful as the mansion is, and as authentic as the grounds are, if there's one aha moment at Mount Vernon, it's when people come out of the dining room onto the piazza and see the sensational view across the Potomac River. And I think it's amazing that just a few decades ago, we were about to lose all of that. There was a threat of not only an oil tank refinery, but also a sewage treatment plant. Can you imagine two more damaging things to that pristine view? And fortunately, we had an insider that really helped us to save that view. We had someone on our board who was also a very important congresswoman, and that would be Frances Payne Bolton.
Using her own funds, Ohio Congresswoman Bolton quickly purchased enough acreage to slow down the developments, and then led a full-fledged lobbying effort to persuade Congress to take defensive action. In 1974, President Gerald Ford signed into law the bill which provided the funding to create Piscataway National Park, protecting the immediate shoreline. And in the years since, Mount Vernon has worked with the National Park Service, the Accokeek Foundation, the Trust for Public Land, and Maryland neighbors to protect additional acreage. Vigilance is still called for, however, because the far ridge of forests, as seen from Mount Vernon's east lawn, remains unprotected. Although the Mount Vernon Ladies Association works hand in glove with several government agencies on a variety of issues, the regent and vice-regents maintain a strong sense of independence.
One of the things we've been able to do as the Mount Vernon Ladies Association is always keep it in private hands. All the money for the past 150 years, all of it that has gone into the restoration and maintenance of the grounds of the estate has come from private people, private enterprise, and individuals, Americans. I think that's a really important fact.
And in recent years, the association's mission has been expanded to embrace a new and urgent challenge. American history in general, and George Washington in particular, are being short-shrifted in classrooms throughout the nation. Future plans call for the construction of a new education center and museum, and the creation of the association's first orientation film.
When I was growing up, there was a portrait of George Washington in every post office in America and practically every classroom, and that's all disappeared. And so as the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, we want to establish here at Mount Vernon a library that will go on to educate forever all of the visitors, not just the children and our grandchildren, but all of the visitors of Mount Vernon, of perhaps the greatest founding father of all.
Many of these went out for white servants as well. On this day in April 1775, I'm not quite sure which it was, 1775, which was a couple of days after the first fighting began, which launched the American War of Independence.
Now in 1763, King George drew a line down the Appalachian Mountains, and he made a proclamation, and he said to the colonists that essentially they no longer had the right of discovery of the empty Indian lands west of Appalachia. This upset the colonists, so a few years later they wrote a letter of protest. In their letter, they accused the king of raising the conditions of new appropriations of land. They went on in their letter to state he has excited domestic insurrections amongst us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages. They signed their letter on July 4th, 1776. Literally 30 lines below the statement, all men are created equal, the Declaration of Independence refers to natives as merciless Indian savages.
10 ads appeared in the Virginia Gazette for runaways. 2 were for black runaways, 8 were for white runaways. 2 of those notices for white runaways were put in by a planter called George Washington. And he was still looking for them after the war.
But I'm supposed to explain, I mean, one thing that we haven't said, for those of you who haven't looked at the basis of how the early American successful colonies worked, was it was through the Virginia Company, which was one of these brand new things called the Joint Stock Company.
Generations of mythmakers have glossed over one of the central realities about the founders. Like their peers in New York, in Massachusetts, in Pennsylvania, James Madison and Thomas Jefferson were Virginians first and Americans second. If we were to understand the Revolution and its aftermath, knowing the Virginians is critical. Into the 1780s, Virginia claimed all the land west of the Mississippi on the basis of the 1609 Jamestown Charter. Virginia's best legal minds subscribed to this interpretation, and this included Madison and Jefferson. The leadership of revolutionary Virginia belonged to land syndicates, borrowing deeply and investing widely in land they had never seen. It's not insignificant that after writing the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson was anxious to return home and take the lead in writing his state's constitution. Virginia was his priority. Virginians thought big. The planter elite had expansive plans. Half of the land of the state was owned by less than 1/10 of the white population, and nearly 40% of the people were enslaved.
It was through the Virginia Company, which was one of these brand new things called the Joint Stock Company. And this was the creation of modern capitalism, modern mercantile capitalism as we know it today. And up until then, up until this period, basically merchants basically worked independently or in loose ad hoc collections of people to fund great enterprises and so on. And the idea was of actually coming together in a more formal way and creating these joint stock companies.
The forests were exactly the reason the king had sent these people to the New England, for here grew the timbers he so needed, tall, straight white pines, ship masts on the stump, free of significant branches for 60, 70, 80 feet or more. Surely the colonists could quickly settle in and get to work supplying valuable resources to the kingdom, with sawmills producing timbers, clapboards, barrel staves, shingles, and all manner of wooden products that England needed 3,000 miles away. But these people had never experienced wilderness forest. The limitless expanses of valuable timber were to them an overwhelming obstacle and daunting challenge. They were utterly reliant on supplies brought on occasional ships from England.
And the Virginia Company was just one of these new joint stock companies, and they were given the right to actually to people a part of this of the new world, and to do so they had various big problems. One, of course, was distance, because it was 3,000 miles away. Another one was that in Elizabethan times they had hoped and had been told that they would find untold wealth in the form of gold and silver, like the Spanish and Portuguese had done further south. And initially they hoped that they would get rich quick on this fantastic scheme of just going there and basically finding gold. And all sorts of totally erroneous reports were brought back by various early adventurers about great quantities of gold. And they had this vision of El Dorado in the north. Now, very quickly, when one barrel supposedly of gold was brought back during the Desert Water Rally, and when it was actually analysed and assayed, of course, it was fool's gold. That dreadful thing that we all know from cowboy westerns and so on, and gold rush movies and so on. We all know that. And this had happened then, and so they realised that if they were going to make this work, it was going to have to be through finding cash crops that would work, and that they'd have to really run plantations. And to do that, to make it work, they needed a huge supply of labor, and they needed it preferably to be cheap labor, or even better, free labor. And so that was how basically the idea of getting people to come, either of rounding up people out of the jails and prisons and so on, or sweeping kids off the street, or also, of course, that the great social benefit was that if you would get rid of all the vagabonds and various sort of lowlife that people didn't like.
That the British and the English hated the most were vagrants.
Vagabonds.
They were idle folk, analogized to weeds stifling healthy growth in a garden. They wandered the countryside, detached from the economy, much like the wasteland left fallow and untilled. So they were rounded up, some were branded, put into workhouses.
What? Sound like slaves.
Children were actually taken off the streets and sold as indentured servants to cruel masters in America.
Vagabonds were not just people without a trade, because a vagabond in the late 1500s, early 1600s, was classed as anybody who's like, if you were a traveling minstrel, you were classed as a vagabond. So Shakespeare, in fact, would have been a vagabond at one time, because he was a member of a group of traveling players. Fortunately, he had very rich allies and patrons, and in fact, the interesting thing was that Shakespeare became an investor in the Virginia Company. So they needed this cheap labor force, and the question was how to get it. And they dressed up these ideas of rounding up basically vagrants, petty criminals, and then, of course, all sorts of dissidents and so on, and they would all be shipped off under the pretense that basically they were the ones who were not criminals and who were not criminalized in this system of rounding up vagrants and homeless children and so on. They used a very interesting technique to actually to persuade people to go there. They called that called headright system, which is how human beings became commoditized. They were turned into commodities, like chattels, like something that could be bought and sold, like a hog or a cow or a goat or anything else. And they became worth a particular amount of money. And this was simply because, and how they became, they turned in from people who were just going to search a new life for themselves, became commodities.
Persons who were kidnapped.